Hey guys, so in the last lesson we talked about the brain. In the previous lessons we've also talked about things like sensory receptors and sensory neurons. Today we're going to be looking specifically at different types of sensory receptors. We're going to be focusing on sensory receptors other than the ones in the eye and the ear, because the eye and the ear have their own lessons entirely, but we're going to be looking at some of the other sensory receptors that exist in your body. So in this lesson on sensory receptors and the senses, we're going to go over what sensory receptors are and how they work. Then we're going to look at the different categories for sensory receptors and some examples of them. And then we're going to specifically look at some of these sensory receptors in the nose, mouth, and on the skin and how they work. Again, we'll focus on the eye and ear in separate lessons later on. We go a lot more in depth into those ones. So sensory receptors are just the nerve endings of sensory neurons, and they detect sensory information. And that could be any changes in both the internal and external environment that they're going to be sensing. Each person's perception of the environment will be unique based on how their cerebral cortex interprets the sensory information that's coming in. Sensory adaptation also occurs, and that's like when you adjust to a change in the environment and your sensory receptors become less sensitive when they're repeatedly stimulated. This is, I think we've talked about it before, but like when you have like your glasses sitting on your head and at first you can feel them and then eventually you can't anymore. That is a type of sensory adaptation. Sensory receptors work by converting different forms of energy into electrochemical energy. Again, the electrochemical energy is like the difference in charge across the membrane of a neuron. So as long as you can convert some type of energy into the electrochemical energy can then be used to fire off an action potential and actually like send that impulse to the central nervous system to be interpreted. Sensory receptors are highly modified dendrites of the sensory neurons. So if you remember, sensory neurons have those little like finger-like projections, those are the dendrites. The sensory receptors are essentially just specialized dendrites that are specialized to detect different types of incoming information. So there's a couple different categories of sensory receptors. The first is a photoreceptor, again, photo meaning light. So photoreceptors respond to visible light. They essentially convert light energy into electrochemical energy. Rods and cones are the two types of photoreceptors that we have in our eye. Then there's chemoreceptors, chemo meaning chemicals. So they respond to specific chemicals that bind to the sensory receptors. So we have chemoreceptors on your tongue. Your taste buds are essentially chemoreceptors. Any food particles that are dissolved in the saliva can bind with the chemoreceptors, and we interpret that as different tastes. You also have chemoreceptors in your nose. Those ones are olfactory receptors, and essentially any molecules that are floating around in the air, those molecules can bind to the chemoreceptors in your nose, and we interpret that as smell. We also have osmoreceptors, which are chemoreceptors that bond to water molecules, and they monitor water levels in your blood, essentially. So when we talked about, was that in Bio 20? I think we talked about like the osmoreceptors in your brain that can detect increased osmotic pressure and cause the release of ADH and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, you have a lot of different chemoreceptors in your body. You have other ones in your arteries that like monitor amounts of carbon dioxide in your blood. You have other ones in your blood vessels that monitor blood pH. So you have chemoreceptors all over your body that are monitoring essentially the chemical composition of different fluids in your body. Plus we have the chemoreceptors in your nose and mouth that we use to sense smell and taste. The third one is mechanoreceptors, which respond to mechanical stimulus. So for example, you have mechanoreceptors in your skin that respond to pressure. That's how we sense touch, is with those kind of mechanoreceptors. We also have mechanoreceptors in our ears. They're called hair cells, but they're not really cells. They're just like tiny hair-shaped cells. And essentially what happens is either a sound wave comes or the fluid in your ear comes and it bends the hair cells. And it is that bending of the cells that is the mechanical stimulus that can cause them to send off an impulse. You also have proprioceptors, which are in your muscles and can detect muscle movements and contractions and stuff like that. It's how our body detects its position and all of that kind of stuff. You also have mechanoreceptors in your arteries and veins that detect the stretching of the blood vessel walls in order to monitor blood pressure. So mechanoreceptors help with feeling touch, they help with sound, and they detect a whole bunch of things that are going on inside of your body as well. So they're on the outside and inside of your body. And then lastly, we have the thermoreceptors, thermo meaning temperature or heat. They're going to respond to changes in temperature. So you have thermoreceptors, again, all over your skin, which respond to changes in temperature. It is important to note that with the thermoreceptors, they don't detect the actual temperature of something, they just detect the change in temperature. So for example, if I were to stick my hand in some lukewarm water, it would feel lukewarm. If I were, instead of doing that, were to put my hand in some ice cold water and let it sit there for a while, and then put my hand in the lukewarm water, that lukewarm water would feel burning. Like it would feel like it was like boiling my hand. And that's because those thermoreceptors aren't detecting the actual temperature of the water, which is lukewarm. They're detecting the change in temperature from like, 2 degrees water to like 30 degrees water. And that massive increase in temperature is what makes it feel like the water is boiling. So thermoreceptors detect changes in temperature, not actual temperature. Our sensory organs are just the organs that are designed to sense changes in the environment, and they contain lots of different sensory neurons with their sensory neurons. They include your skin, your nose, your tongue, your eyes, and your ears. Your taste buds are these specialized chemoreceptors in your tongue. Again, any chemicals that are dissolved in the saliva can be detected by those taste buds, by those chemoreceptors. And as soon as a chemical binds with the taste bud, that taste bud is going to depolarize. It's going to cause its own action potential to fire, and then that impulse gets sent from that sensory receptor to different sensory neurons, to the interneurons at the spinal cord, and up to the brain. Then the thalamus is going to direct that incoming impulse to the parietal lobe, which will then actually interpret that as a specific taste. The salivary glands are also connected to the brainstem and are stimulated when we taste or smell or even just think about something that's really delicious. You'll start like drooling. The olfactory receptors, as we said, are chemoreceptors in your nose. They line the upper nasal cavity and they detect airborne chemicals. Again, if you have a particle bind to the olfactory receptor, it is going to cause that receptor to depolarize. So sodium rushes in to the neuron. That causes the action potential to get sent. And that impulse is going to go again from the sensory receptor through the sensory neurons, interneurons in the spinal cord, and up to the olfactory bulb, which is attached to the temporal lobe. That's where it gets interpreted. It does also get sent to the frontal lobe. That's why you have a lot of like memories associated with smells. Okay, and then your skin has tons of mechanoreceptors and thermoreceptors. Again, the mechanoreceptors sense touch. They're really concentrated in areas of like your face, your hands and fingers, your genitals. Compared to like your hands, your like upper arm or your back has very, very few relatively mechanoreceptors. We did this experiment when I was in university where they took two like pins and like stuck them into your hand, and you had to tell if you were getting pricked by just one pin or both pins at the same time. And the closer together the pins were, the harder it was to tell if it was just one pin or two pins poking you. And then the further apart, the easier it was to tell that it was two pins. And on your hand, the pins didn't have to get very far apart before you could feel two separate pin points. But on like your upper arm, like near your elbow, they were like 5 centimeters apart before I could actually feel two separate pin pricks. And that's because you have so many more mechanoreceptors in your hand than on, say, your arm. Anyway, we also have thermoreceptors, which again, don't respond to specific temperatures, but will detect a change in temperature. Okay, that is it for today's lesson. I think next up we're going to be going on to the eye and then the ear after that.